The pen felt heavier than it had any right to be. I remember staring at it, that stupid black fountain pen resting in its velvet groove like a sleeping animal, and thinking that somewhere in the last 6 months my life had turned into the kind of story people whisper about in pack meetings. The Omega who sold himself to save his family. The Omega who married a stranger for a number with too many zeros on it. I never thought I would become the cautionary tale. I never thought I would become anyone's story at all. But there I was, in a glass office that smelled of cedar and money, across a desk from Charles Decker, about to sign my name beneath his. He didn't look at me the way alphas usually did. No hunger, no smugness, no pity. He looked at me the way you look at a contract clause you've already decided to accept. Carefully, but without sentiment. That should have warned me. Instead, it steadied me. I could work with indifference. Indifference didn't ask anything of me except my signature. Once you sign, he said, voice low and even, there's no walking it back. 2 years, minimum. My name, my house, my protection. In exchange, your father's debts disappear and your brother keeps his position at the clinic. That's the whole of it. No romance implied. No expectations beyond appearances at required functions. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because 2 years suddenly sounded like a very long time to spend pretending to be something I wasn't, standing beside a man built like a fortress, with eyes the color of wet slate. And after the 2 years? I asked. After, you walk away with a settlement large enough that you never have to sign anything like this again. I signed. My hand didn't shake, which surprised me more than anything else that day. The wedding happened 11 days later, in a room with too much white and too few people who actually cared whether Charles Decker lived or died, myself included at the time. My mother cried, but not from joy. She cried the way people cry at funerals, quietly and with her hand pressed to her mouth like she was holding something in. My father didn't come. My brother, Rowan, stood beside me and squeezed my hand hard enough to hurt, which was the only thing that kept me upright. Charles wore black. I wore something pale and borrowed and itchy at the collar, and when the officiant asked if I would bond myself to this man in the eyes of pack and law, I said yes without any bond at all. No mating mark, no scent exchange, nothing but paperwork and a ring that felt cold going onto my finger. He didn't kiss me. He shook my hand afterward, in front of everyone, like we'd closed a business deal instead of gotten married. Which, I suppose, we had. I caught his scent for the first time properly that day. Bergamot and something darker underneath, like rain on hot stone. Alphas' scents were supposed to comfort Omegas, some biological leftover from a time before elevators and marriage contracts. His didn't comfort me. It made my skin feel too small for my body, and I hated that it did, because hating it was easier than wondering why. There was a small reception afterward, more for the photographers than for us, and I remember standing beside him with a glass of something sparkling I never drank. Watching him accept congratulations from men in expensive suits who all seemed to know exactly what kind of marriage this was and were too polite or too frightened of him to say so out loud. He kept one hand at the small of my back the entire time, light as a suggestion, and I told myself it meant nothing beyond the performance of it. When the last guest finally left, he walked me to the car himself instead of letting the driver do it, and for a moment, standing in the cold with the reception lights behind us. He looked almost uncertain, an expression so unlike him that I filed it away without understanding it yet. "You did well today," he said. "I know none of this is what you would have chosen." "Did you choose it either?" I asked, before I could stop myself. "Really choose it, I mean. Or did the business choose it for you the same way the debt chose it for me?" Something moved behind his eyes, quick and gone. "I chose you specifically, out of a list of candidates my lawyer put together. That's more choice than either of us has had in most of this." He opened the car door for me. "That's all I can offer you tonight. I'm sorry it isn't more." He didn't come back to the house with me that first night. "Some business matter," he said, "that couldn't wait," though I suspected even then it was an excuse to give us both room to breathe. I lay awake in an unfamiliar bed in my wedding clothes, listening to a house I didn't know yet, and wondered how long it would take before any of it started feeling like mine. The house he brought me to swallowed sound. Every room was too large, every hallway too quiet, and my footsteps on the marble floors sounded like an intrusion. He showed me to a wing on the east side, separate from his own, and told me the staff had been informed I was to be treated as lady, as Omega, of the house, with anything I required. I don't require much, I told him, arms crossed over the small bag I'd brought, because everything else of mine had stayed behind with a family I wasn't sure would still want me once the money came through. Something flickered behind his eyes then, not quite pity. Closer to recognition, like he understood the particular flavor of loneliness I was carrying and didn't especially want to look at it too closely. There's a schedule, he said instead. We're treating into logistics the way I'd learned he always did when something got too close to real. Dinners together twice a week, for the staff and for appearances. Public events, I'll notify you in advance. Beyond that, my time is my own and yours is yours. How generous, I said, and I meant it as a knife, but he only nodded like I'd complimented him sincerely and walked away. I spent that first night in a bed the size of a small country, listening to a house that didn't know me yet, wondering how long 2 years could possibly feel. The answer, it turned out, was that 2 years could feel like nothing at all, once certain things started happening that neither of us had put in the contract. The first month, we were strangers performing marriage. He left before I woke, came home after I'd already retreated to my wing, and our twice-weekly dinners were conducted with the warmth of 2 diplomats negotiating a border dispute. I learned to read the newspaper upside down from across the table just to have something to look at besides his face, which had an unfortunate habit of being handsome in a way that annoyed me on principle. I learned things about him in fragments, the way you learn a language by accident. That he took his coffee black and drank too much of it. That he flexed his left hand when he was thinking, an old injury maybe, though I never asked. That the staff adored him quietly and feared him a little, the way people fear mountains. Not because the mountain has done anything wrong, but because of what it could do if it wanted to. I told myself none of it mattered. I told myself a great many things that spring that turned out, later, to be lies I'd needed at the time. One of our required dinners fell on a night when the kitchen staff had gone home early for some festival in town, and rather than call them back, Charles simply walked into the kitchen himself and started opening cabinets like a man who had once known his way around one and hadn't been allowed to in years. "You cook?" I asked, hovering in the doorway, more curious than I wanted to admit. "Badly," he admitted, pulling out a pan. "My mother used to. Before, I remember enough to be dangerous." I ended up at the counter beside him, chopping vegetables I didn't trust him with, and for the first time since the wedding, the silence between us stopped feeling like a wall and started feeling like something closer to companionable. He told me, without quite meaning to, about learning to cook at 8 years old because his mother had been too sick most weeks to stand long at a stove, and how his father had never once set foot in that kitchen in all the years after her death. "Why not?" I asked. "Grief makes some men very good at avoiding rooms," he said, and something in his voice told me not to press further, so I didn't. We ate at the small kitchen table instead of the enormous dining room that seated 20, and for the length of one meal, neither of us performed anything at all. It didn't last. The next dinner was back to the dining room, back to newspapers held up like shields, back to careful distance. But I found myself thinking about that kitchen table more than I wanted to. In the weeks that followed, it had been the first time Charles Decker looked like a person to me instead of a signature on a contract. The incident with Julian Ash happened in the second month, and it was the first time I saw something crack in Charles Decker's careful architecture. Julian was an old friend of the family, an alpha with a reputation for being handsome and knowing it, and he'd cornered me at a charity gala with a glass of champagne and a smile that assumed too much. "Contract marriages don't count for much," he'd murmured, close enough that his breath moved my hair. "Everyone knows what this is. A transaction. You don't owe him fidelity for a transaction." I was still working out how to extract myself politely. Politeness had been drilled into me since I was small, and Omega's first and most exhausting inheritance, when a hand closed around my elbow. Gentle as a suggestion, but with no give in it at all. "Julian, Charles's voice was pleasant, pleasantly terrifying. "You're crowding my husband." Husband. Julian's smile didn't waver, but something behind his eyes recalculated. "Of course. My apologies. I only meant to be friendly. No harm intended, Decker." "None taken," Charles said, in a tone that suggested a great deal of harm would be taken if Julian didn't remove himself within the next several seconds. Julian, to his credit, understood the dialect of alpha civility well enough to read the actual message underneath it. He left. Charles didn't. His hand stayed on my elbow a beat longer than necessary, and when I looked up at him, I found he was already looking down at me, his jaw tight, his scent gone sharp and possessive in a way I felt in my back teeth. Across the room, I noticed a handful of guests watching us with the particular hunger of people hoping to witness a scandal, and I understood distantly that Julian's comment about transactions hadn't been a private cruelty. It was the polite version of what half this room already believed about us. The realization sat cold in my stomach the rest of the evening, no matter how many times I told myself it shouldn't matter what strangers assumed about a marriage they knew nothing real about. "You didn't need to do that," I said, once we were in the car, once the privacy glass had gone up between us and the driver. "I know. Then why?" "Then why?" "Because I signed a contract that says you're under my protection," he said, staring out the window instead of at me. "I intend to honor every clause of it." "Is that all it was? Protection?" He was quiet long enough that I thought he wouldn't answer at all. "No," he said finally, still not looking at me. "It wasn't only that. I didn't like the way he was looking at you. I didn't like it more than a man in a business arrangement is supposed to mind such things." I didn't know what to do with that, so I said nothing, and neither did he, and we rode the rest of the way home in a silence that had changed shape without either of us naming how. I wanted to believe his first answer was the whole truth. It would be a while yet before I understood it wasn't, not entirely, that somewhere underneath the contract language, something inconvenient and entirely unplanned had already begun. My heat came early, and it came like a betrayal. I'd been on suppressants for years, the good kind, the kind that were supposed to make an Omega's whole biology into a manageable, schedulable thing. But stress does strange things to a body, and between the wedding and the moving and the low hum of anxiety that had lived in my chest since the day I signed that contract, my body apparently decided the suppressants were a suggestion rather than a rule. It hit me on a Thursday evening, fast and total, the kind of heat that turns your skin into something foreign and your mind into a single, humiliating want. I made it to my room. I didn't make it much further than that. I remember the fever, the way my own touch wasn't enough, the way I curled around a pillow that didn't smell like anyone and cried from frustration more than desire. Charles found me because the house staff, panicked and unwilling to overstep, had gone to him instead of calling a clinic, and by the time he pushed open my door, I was beyond caring about pride. He stood in the doorway. I remember that clearly, how he stood there not coming closer, his knuckles white on the frame, his scent gone thick and dark with the particular alpha response to an Omega in heat, and how he still didn't cross the threshold. "Charles," I managed, and it came out wrecked, needy in a way I would have died of embarrassment over on any other day. "I'm calling a doctor," he said, voice rough, strained like it was costing him something physical to say it. I'm not going to touch you like this, not when you can't consent to it properly. Not ever like this." I hated him a little, in the moment, for having that much restraint when I had none. I understand now that it was the single kindest thing anyone had done for me in years, and that it cost him more than I knew to say it and mean it. He didn't call a doctor in the end. He called his old nurse instead, a retired Omega named Odalis, who arrived within the hour with suppressant injections and a look that suggested she'd seen this exact situation play out before in this exact house, though I never learned whose heat that had been. Charles didn't leave the hallway outside my door the entire night. I know because when the fever finally broke near dawn and Odalis had gone, I found him still there, sitting on the floor with his back against my doorframe, asleep, sitting up like a man keeping watch over something he refused to name. I woke him gently, more out of concern for his neck than anything else, and for a moment before either of us was fully conscious, He reached up and pressed his palm to my cheek like he was checking I was real. Then he seemed to catch himself and pulled his hand back, and the careful distance he wore like armor most days slid back into place. "I'm sorry," I said, mortified, my voice still raw from the night before. "You shouldn't have had to see any of that. I should have told the staff to just call a clinic and take me somewhere else." "Don't," he said, sharper than I expected, then softer. "Don't apologize for your own body doing something it couldn't help. I'm only sorry it happened here, unprepared, without warning either of us." He hesitated, that flexing of his left hand starting up, the tell I'd already learned to recognize. "I want you to know nothing that happened last night changes the terms between us. You don't owe me anything for it. I didn't do it to collect on some invisible debt." "I know that," I said, and found, to my own surprise, that I did know it, completely. "I think that's actually the problem, Charles. I keep waiting for you to want something from me the way everyone always has, and you keep not doing it." He looked at me for a long moment, something unreadable passing over his face, and didn't answer. But he stayed for breakfast that morning, in my wing instead of his, and it became, without either of us deciding it out loud, a habit that persisted long after the heat itself had faded from memory. Quick pause here. If you want to watch our videos early with 0 ads or get access to exclusive videos, our Patreon has you covered, link in the description. Alright, back to where things get interesting. Something shifted after that. Not dramatically. Nothing so simple as a single scene changing everything. But slowly, the way a tide comes in without announcing itself, until one day you look down and realize the water's at your knees. He started coming home earlier. Not every night, but enough that I noticed, and hated that I noticed, and noticed anyway. Our dinners stopped feeling like negotiations and started feeling like something closer to conversation. I learned he'd lost his mother young, that his father had built the Decker business into something enormous and cold and left it to Charles, the way you'd leave someone a debt rather than a gift. I learned he read poetry in secret. Actual poetry, hidden in a drawer in his study like it embarrassed him. I told him things too. About my father's gambling, the debts that had put me on that velvet-lined desk in the first place. About Rowan, and how he'd been the only person in my family who ever treated me like a person instead of an obligation. About the particular loneliness of being raised to be married off, of having your entire worth explained to you in terms of usefulness. "That's not what you are," Charles said, the night I told him that part, his voice low and certain in a way that startled me. "Usefulness. That's not what you are to me. What am I to you then?" I asked, and I meant it lightly, meant it as something to deflect with. But he looked at me for a long moment before answering, and the answer he gave wasn't light at all. "I don't know yet," he said. "But it isn't nothing. It stopped being nothing somewhere around the 3rd month, and I don't know what to do about that." Neither did I. I still went to bed that night and lay awake with my hand pressed to my own chest, feeling my heart do something reckless and unauthorized. Wondering when exactly Charles Decker had stopped being my captor and started being someone I wanted to see across a table twice a week, then 3 times, then every night. There was a pack council function in the middle of the 4th month, a formal dinner. Charles was required to attend as part of Decker Holdings standing among the pack elite, and it was there I first saw a flicker of something in him that mirrored what I'd felt at that gala with Julian Ash. An Omega named Tio, elegant and self-assured, had been seated beside Charles by some careless arrangement of place cards and spent most of the evening leaning a little too close, laughing a little too warmly at things that weren't especially funny. I watched from 3 seats down, absurdly, uncomfortably jealous of a man I had no real claim to be jealous over, since our bond hadn't yet been made and our marriage was still on paper. The transaction everyone assumed it to be. Charles was unfailingly polite the entire evening and unfailingly distant in a way that seemed to frustrate Tio more with every course. It was only in the car afterward when I made an offhand too-sharp comment about how nice it must have been to have company for once, that Charles turned to look at me with an expression somewhere between amusement and disbelief. "Are you jealous?" he asked, like the idea hadn't occurred to him as something that could apply to me. "No," I said, entirely unconvincingly. Kirk. His mouth curved, the first real smile I'd gotten out of him in days. I didn't hear a single word that man said all evening. I was watching you laugh at something Counselor Hale said, 3 seats down, and wondering what it would take to make you laugh like that at something I said instead. I didn't have a response for that. He reached over in the dark of the car and took my hand, and neither of us let go the rest of the way home, and it was, I think now, one of the first nights either of us admitted, without quite saying the words outright, that whatever this was becoming, it had already stopped being anything close to a transaction for either of us. Rowan came to visit near the end of the 4th month, ostensibly to check on me, though I suspected the truth was closer to wanting to see the man who'd bought his brother out of a debt for himself. Charles cleared his afternoon without being asked, which surprised me more than it should have, and sat with us in the garden while Rowan interrogated him with the particular thoroughness of a younger sibling who had appointed himself family protector. "Do you love him?" Rowan asked, point blank, halfway through tea, in the way only Rowan could get away with. Charles didn't flinch, though I nearly dropped my cup. "I respect him. I'm growing to care for him more than I expected to when I drafted that contract." He glanced at me, something careful and searching in his expression. "I don't think either of us has decided yet what to call it beyond that." "That's a very lawyerly answer," Rowan said. "I'm aware," Charles said, and for the first time since I'd known him, he actually laughed. A real laugh, startled out of him, warm in a way that changed his whole face. Rowan looked at me afterward with an expression I recognized, one that said, quite clearly, he's not what I expected either. Knox. When Rowan left that evening, he hugged me tightly at the door and murmured, low enough that only I could hear, "I don't think you hate this marriage as much as you tell Mom you do." I didn't have an answer for him. I wasn't sure yet, myself, what the honest one would have been. There was a quiet stretch right at the start of the 5th month before Vane's threats ever reached us, when I let myself believe things might simply continue this way, gently, without incident. The two of us drifting closer by inches with no crisis forcing the pace. Charles took me to a small observatory an hour outside the city, one clear night, a place he said he used to visit alone as a boy whenever the house got too loud with his father's grief. We lay on the hood of the car afterward, in defiance of every dignified expectation either of our positions demanded, tracing constellations neither of us actually knew the names of and inventing better ones instead. He told me, quietly, that he'd never brought anyone else here, not out of secrecy, just because there had never before been anyone he wanted to. "Why me?" I asked, watching the sky instead of him, because it felt easier to ask difficult questions without his eyes on mine. "Out of that whole list your lawyer put together, why did you pick me?" He was quiet long enough that I thought he might deflect, the way he so often still did when a question cut too close to something real. "Your file said you'd given up your own studies to help cover your father's debts before the marriage was even on the table," he said finally. "Everyone else on that list had a reason to want this arrangement. You were the only one who had every reason to resent it, and agreed anyway, because it meant protecting people you loved. I wanted someone who understood what it cost to sacrifice something for family. I didn't expect I'd end up wanting so much more than that from you. I didn't have an answer worthy of that, so I simply reached over and laced our fingers together atop the cooling metal of the car, and we stayed like that until the cold finally drove us back inside, neither of us in any particular hurry to end the night. The business crisis came in the 5th month, and it nearly ruined everything before it had properly begun. Decker Holdings had a rival, a man named Marcus Vane, an alpha with old money and older grudges, who had spent years trying to force Charles into selling off pieces of a company his father had built. When direct pressure hadn't worked, Vane apparently decided a different kind of leverage might. He found out about the contract. Not the marriage. Everyone knew about the marriage, but the specific, damning terms of it. The debt clearance, the 2-year clock, the settlement at the end. He threatened to leak it to every gossip outlet that covered the pack elite, to paint Charles as a man who bought his Omega-like inventory, to paint me as exactly what Julian Ash had implied I was months before, a transaction, nothing more. Charles told me himself, which surprised me, He could have hidden it, he chose not to. He wants me to fold on the merger, he said, pacing his study in a way I'd never seen him pace, controlled fury radiating off him like heat off asphalt. He thinks exposing the contract will humiliate me into compliance. Will it? No. He stopped pacing, looked at me. But it will humiliate you, and I never agreed to put that on you. I'm ending it. The contract, the whole arrangement, early. I'll clear your family's debts regardless. That part was never contingent on the 2 years. You shouldn't have to be collateral in a fight that isn't yours. I don't know what came over me in that moment. Some instinct that had been building for months without my permission. Some refusal I didn't know I had in me. I want to be honest. It wasn't as simple as one conversation, no matter how it might sound, telling it back now. There was a night 2 days before that scene in his study when I overheard him on the phone with his lawyer discussing the settlement figures for what he called an early dissolution, and I spent an entire evening convinced he was already halfway to signing me away before Vane could force his hand. I didn't sleep. I sat in my wing with the lights off, running through every version of the last 5 months, wondering if I'd imagined the warmth I thought had grown between us, wondering if I was, after all, exactly as disposable as Julian Ash had implied at that gala. I confronted him about it the next morning, angrier than I had any right to be for a man who'd technically done nothing but try to protect me. You were already planning to end it, I said, arms crossed, standing in his study doorway like an accusation. Before you even told me about Vane, I heard you on the phone. I was preparing options, he said carefully, in case you wanted out once you knew the truth of what Vane intended to do. I wasn't going to force you to stay in something that was about to become a public humiliation without giving you a way to leave with dignity. You could have asked me first, instead of deciding for me what I could handle. You're right, he admitted, and the easy honesty of it took some of the fight out of me. I've spent so many years making decisions alone that I forgot how to make one with someone else in the room. I'm sorry. That wasn't fair to you. It was the first real apology anyone had given me in longer than I could remember. Not an excuse dressed up as one, just a plain admission that he'd been wrong. It didn't erase the fear of that sleepless night, but it went a long way toward healing it, and it was in the wake of that apology, not before it, that he told me the rest about Vane and asked what I wanted to do. No, I said. He blinked. Kirk, you don't get to decide that for me. If Vane wants to make this ugly, let him. I'm not scared of gossip. I'm not some fragile thing that needs protecting from the truth of how we started. I stepped closer, close enough to catch that bergamot and rain scent that had stopped unsettling me months ago and started doing something else entirely to my chest. I signed that contract because I had no other choice. I'm choosing to stay now because I do. His hand came up, slow, like he was giving me every chance to step back, and cupped the side of my face. His thumb moved once against my cheekbone, careful, like I was something that might break or might bolt, and I did neither. Say that again, he said, voice gone rough. I'm choosing to stay, I said. I think I have been for a while. He kissed me then. It wasn't gentle, not entirely. It was 5 months of restraint breaking all at once, his hand fisting carefully in my hair. My fingers curling into the front of his shirt, like I could pull the last of the distance between us, closed by force. When we broke apart, both of us breathing like we'd run somewhere, he pressed his forehead to mine. I was going to let you go, he said. I had myself half convinced I could. I don't think I can anymore. Then don't, I said. Fight Vane. Fight him with everything you've got. I'll be standing right here when you're done. We fought Vane together in the end. And it turned out an Omega, who'd grown up watching his father destroy a family through financial recklessness, had a very particular set of skills when it came to finding the rot in someone else's ledgers. I found 3 years of buried fraud in Vane's own holdings within a week, quietly, through contacts Rowan still had at the clinic where half of Vane's shell companies had laundered donations. The night before Charles took it to the PAC Council, I sat with him at his desk until nearly 2 a.m, cross-referencing figures, watching the tired satisfaction spread across his face as the pieces locked into place. At one point, he looked up from the papers and simply watched me for a long moment, like he was memorizing something. "What?" I asked. "Nothing," he said. "Just thank you for this. For staying, when I gave you every reason not to." He reached over and tucked a strand of hair back from my face, a small gesture, unhurried, and neither of us mentioned it again that night, though I felt the warmth of it long after. Charles took the evidence to the Pack Council before Vane could take anything to the press. Vane didn't just fold. He disappeared from polite Pack society entirely, the way powerful men do when the thing they were counting on to make them untouchable turns out to make them radioactive instead. Charles kissed me in the elevator afterward, in front of his own board of directors, with a thoroughness that left absolutely no room for gossip columns to speculate about the nature of our marriage. I didn't mind. For the first time since that velvet-lined desk, I didn't feel like anyone's transaction. I felt like his, and it felt like the safest thing I'd ever been. The weeks after Vane's disappearance from Pack Society were, strangely, some of the gentlest of my life. Charles started calling from the office in the middle of the day for no reason at all, just to ask what I was doing. A habit that embarrassed him faintly every time he did it, and that I never once told him to stop. We took to walking the grounds in the evenings, the enormous house at our backs, talking about nothing important. Books he loved, and I hadn't read a hiking trip I'd taken with Rowan as a teenager. The particular stubbornness of a garden he was trying unsuccessfully to keep alive without a groundskeeper's help. There was an evening about 2 weeks after the elevator when a storm rolled in fast and hard while we were still out walking, and we ended up soaked through and laughing on the porch steps instead of running for shelter like sensible people. He looked at me, rain plastering his hair down, water running in rivulets off his jaw, and there was something so unguarded in his expression that my chest ached with it. "I keep waiting to regret this," he admitted, quiet under the sound of the rain. "Some part of me keeps expecting to wake up and find out this was a mistake, the way everything else I've built my life around eventually turns out to be. But I don't. I wake up every day and I'm relieved you're still here." "I'm not going anywhere," I said, and meant it with a certainty that startled even me. He kissed me then slow and soaped and entirely unhurried out on those porch steps with thunder rolling somewhere over the hills. And it was nothing like the kiss in his study or the one in the elevator. This one felt like a promise instead of a discovery, like two people who already knew exactly what they were choosing. We told our small circle of people not long after. Rowan first, who only smiled like he'd known all along, then my mother, who cried the good kind of tears again, then eventually the staff, who I'm fairly certain had placed private bets on us for months already and simply nodded like the outcome had never been in question. The bonding happened 3 weeks later, and unlike the wedding, nothing about it was for show. The night before, we lay awake talking long past midnight, the kind of conversation that circles back on itself because neither person wants it to end. Charles told me for the first time about the Omega his father had once tried to force him to bond with as a teenager, a political match, cold and transactional in exactly the way our own marriage had started, and how he'd fought his father for 2 years rather than let it happen. "That's part of why the contract was worded the way it was," he admitted, his fingers tracing idle patterns against my palm in the dark. "I told myself I would never let anyone bond to me who hadn't chosen it freely, with every clause of the choice available to them. I built an entire company around not needing anyone, specifically so I'd never be forced into something like that again. And then I met you, and every rule I'd built for myself started falling apart within a season." "Do you regret that?" I asked. "The rules falling apart?" "Every day," he said, and at my sharp intake of breath he laughed and pulled me closer. "Every day I regret it a little less than the day before. Ask me again in 50 years. I suspect the regret will have vanished entirely by then." We didn't tell the staff in advance. We didn't invite anyone. It was just the two of us in his room. Our room by then, since I'd stopped sleeping in the East Wing sometime around the 6th month, and neither of us had ever discussed it. We'd simply stopped pretending distance was necessary. "You don't have to," he murmured against my throat, his mouth hovering just above the gland at the curve of my neck, his whole body trembling with the effort of asking instead of taking. This isn't in any contract, Kirk. This is forever, if we do this. There's no clean settlement at the end of a bond. I know what a bond is, Charles. I tilted my head back, baring my throat to him on purpose, a gesture that meant something ancient and unambiguous between Alpha and Omega. I'm not asking for an exit clause. I want forever. I want it with you. His teeth found the gland with a care that undid me more than any rougher claiming could have. The bite bloomed hot and bright, a pain that unraveled almost instantly into something else entirely, a rightness, a settling, like a key finding the lock it had been cut for. I felt him in a way I'd never felt anyone, a warmth low in my chest that I understood, distantly, was the bond itself. The two of us now written into each other on some level deeper than paperwork. I marked him in return, my own teeth against his throat, awkward and inexperienced but fierce, and felt him shudder under me like something enormous had finally been allowed to exhale. Mine, he said against my hair afterward, voice wrecked, reverent. Contract be damned. Mine. Yours, I agreed, and meant it more completely than I had ever meant anything in my life. The weeks after the bond settled into something I hadn't dared imagine for myself, back when I'd signed my name beneath his in that glass office, I could feel him now in a way that had nothing to do with the house's hallways. A low, steady warmth at the edge of my awareness whenever he was near, a flicker of unease if he was troubled. Even from another room. He told me he felt the same of me, that he'd caught himself in board meetings, distracted by a contentment that had no obvious source until he realized it was simply mine. Bleeding faintly across the bond because I happened to be having a good afternoon in the garden. We settled, too, into small rituals that felt entirely ours. Sunday mornings became sacred somehow. The two of us lingering in bed long after either of us needed to, trading lazy conversation and lazier kisses, the whole house quiet around us like it approved. He started bringing me small, unnecessary gifts. A book he thought I'd like, flowers from a garden bed he'd finally gotten to bloom. A ridiculous ceramic fox he found at a market stall that now sat on my nightstand for no reason either of us could explain, except that it had made me laugh when I first saw it. Odalis, still visiting periodically to check on the bonds settling, remarked once that she'd rarely seen a newly bonded pair adjust so quickly, so completely. And Charles had simply looked at me across the room with an expression that answered the observation better than any words could have. 2 months after the bonding, I started being sick in the mornings, and for 3 days I told myself it was stress or bad seafood or the flu going around the staff quarters, because the alternative hadn't occurred to me as something that could actually happen to me specifically in my actual life. Charles noticed before I let myself admit it out loud. Bonded mates, it turns out, feel more than just each other's moods. He told me later that my scent had begun shifting subtly over those 3 days, sweeter, somehow softer. A change so slight I hadn't noticed it myself, but that had pulled at something instinctive in him every time I walked past. He didn't say anything at first, just watched me with a quiet, careful attention that made me self-conscious before I understood why. On the 3rd morning, when I came back from being sick with my hand braced against the bathroom doorframe, he was already standing there with a glass of water and an expression I couldn't quite read. Hope, carefully leashed. Like he didn't dare let himself want the thing he was already halfway to guessing. "Kirk," he said gently, "how long has this been happening?" 3 days. It's probably nothing. Something I ate or, he said, and didn't finish the sentence, just reached out and smoothed his thumb along my cheekbone. The same gesture from the night Vane's threat had broken us open to each other. "Will you let Odalis look, just to be sure, for my own peace of mind, if nothing else?" Odalis was the one who said it plainly, when Charles, worried, hovering in a way that would have been comical if it weren't so tender, finally insisted she examine me. "You're pregnant," she said, matter of fact, like she was reading me the weather. "About 6 weeks along, from the look of things. Congratulations." The word didn't land right away. I sat there on the edge of the bed, hand pressed flat against a stomach that looked exactly the same as it always had, and felt the entire architecture of my understanding of my own life quietly rearrange itself. I hadn't let myself think about children. Not once. Not in the contract negotiations. Not in the wedding. Not even after the bond, because children had always been a thing that happened to other people's marriages. Real marriages. Ones built on choice from the very beginning instead of a velvet pen and a number with too many zeros. I hadn't let myself want it because wanting things that weren't guaranteed had never once gone well for me. Charles's face, when Odalis told him, did something I'd never seen it do. It cracked open entirely, every careful, controlled line of him giving way at once, his eyes going bright and stunned, his hand finding mine and gripping it like he needed the anchor. "A child," he said, like he was testing the shape of the words in his mouth. "Kirk, we're going to have a child. Are you?" My voice came out smaller than I meant it to. "Are you happy? Really? Because I know this wasn't. We never talked about this, and I don't want you to feel like this is one more thing you have to, Kirk." He cut me off gently, pulling me against his chest, his mouth pressed to my hair. His heartbeat hammering under my ear loud enough that I could feel just how much the calm on his face was costing him to maintain. "I have spent the last 8 months falling in love with you by accident, in a marriage I built specifically to have no room for accidents. This isn't an obligation. This is the best thing that's ever happened to me, and it's happening because of you." I cried then, the kind of crying that comes from somewhere so deep you don't fully understand its source until it's already happening. Relief and disbelief. And a joy so unfamiliar it felt almost dangerous to let myself feel it all the way through. "I love you," I said into his shirt, muffled and inelegant and entirely true. "I don't think I ever told you that properly. I love you, Charles Decker, and I didn't sign up for that. Nobody wrote that into any contract." "No," he agreed, laughing wet and unsteady against my hair. "Nobody wrote it in. We wrote it ourselves. Every clause of it. There was a frightening week near the end of the 3rd month when I woke to a cramping ache low in my belly and a smear of blood that sent both of us into a silent, terrified drive to the clinic before the sun had properly risen. Charles didn't speak the entire way there. I could feel his fear through the bond, sharp and metallic, worse somehow than anything I felt myself, because I understood distantly that he was trying to hold both our terror at once so I wouldn't have to carry mine alone. The clinic, Omega Obstetrician, an unhurried woman named Dr. Ko. Pharaoh, spent what felt like an hour with a monitor pressed to my stomach before the sound we'd been straining for finally filled the room, fast, steady, undiminished. "She's fine," Dr. Pharaoh said, kind and matter-of-fact. "Some spotting is common and rarely means anything serious, but I understand why it frightened you both." Charles didn't say anything the entire walk back to the car. It was only once we were inside, doors shut, engine off, that he pressed his forehead to the steering wheel and I realized, with a jolt, that he was shaking. "Charles, I have never," he said, voice rough, not lifting his head, "been afraid of anything the way I was afraid this morning. Not Vane. Not my father. Nothing has ever frightened me the way the thought of losing either of you did in that car on the way there." I reached over and took his hand, lacing our fingers together the way we had 100 times since the bonding, and felt something in him ease at the contact, the fear receding slowly across the space between us. "We're both still here," I said. "All 3 of us." "All 3 of us," he repeated, like he needed to hear it said aloud to believe it fully, and turned his hand to grip mine tighter before finally starting the car. The months that followed were not, if I'm honest, entirely without difficulty. My body did strange and occasionally undignified things. Charles hovered in ways that were sweet until they became slightly suffocating, and I had to remind him, more than once, that I was pregnant and not made of glass. He rearranged half his business schedule to be present for every appointment, every checkup, every moment, where Odalis pressed a cool instrument to my stomach and let us hear for the first time, somewhere around the 4th month, the fast, determined thrum of a heartbeat that belonged to neither of us and to both of us entirely. We told my family before we told his board of directors, which I think surprised him more than it surprised me. My mother cried again, but this time it was the good kind. The kind where the hand over the mouth is holding in joy instead of grief. Rowan hugged me so hard I nearly lost my breath and told me quietly that he'd known from the very first month. From the way I talked about Charles, even when I pretended I didn't want to talk about him at all. That this arrangement had never really been the transaction everyone assumed it was. My father didn't come to that either. Some things, I've learned, don't rewrite themselves just because the rest of your life does. I made peace with that a long time before the baby came. Charles held my hand through the parts that still hurt and didn't try to fix what wasn't his to fix, which was its own kind of love. Charles's own family, what remained of it, took the news differently. His father, a tall, silver-templed man with the same slate eyes as his son, but none of the warmth I'd learned to find underneath them. Arrived for a single stiff dinner and spent most of it asking pointed questions about securing the succession properly, as though our daughter were a line item rather than a person. Charles's jaw had tightened through the entire meal, and once his father left, he apologized to me 3 separate times for a man who had never once, in his life, apologized for anything himself. He's not wrong that the company will need an heir eventually, Charles admitted afterward, tired, sitting across from me at the small kitchen table that had become, by then, our favorite spot in the whole enormous house. But that isn't why I want this. I want to be nothing like him when it comes to her. I want her to know she was wanted for herself, not for what she could inherit. She will, I said, certain of it in a way I hadn't been certain of much in my life. Because you're already nothing like him, you proved that the night you sat outside my door instead of walking through it. We found out, near the start of the 6th month, that the baby was a girl in a small appointment room with Dr. Quest. Pharaoh smiling over the monitor and Charles gripping my hand so tightly I had to remind him, laughing, that I still needed the circulation in my fingers. He cried quietly, unguarded, in a way I don't think he'd allowed himself to be since childhood, and pressed his lips to my temple and murmured her name for the first time. A name we'd argued over gently for weeks, and finally agreed on that same afternoon sitting in the car outside the clinic. Neither of us in any hurry to drive away. We spent an entire Sunday after that painting a nursery in the East Wing, the same wing I'd once slept in alone during those first cold months of the marriage, now transformed into something soft and yellow and full of a future neither of us had planned for, but both of us, by then, wanted more than anything else in our lives. There were harder weeks too, the kind that don't make it into the version of a story people like to tell afterward. Around the 7th month, I went through a stretch of nights where sleep wouldn't come at all, my mind circling back to old fears, that I wasn't built for this, that some part of me was still the boy who'd signed his name away out of desperation and had no idea how to be anyone's parent, let alone the parent of a child born into a marriage that had started as a transaction. I said as much to Charles one night, curled against his chest, ashamed of how small my voice sounded. He didn't rush to reassure me the way I half expected. He listened, all the way through, his hand moving slow and steady along my back, and only spoke once I'd run entirely out of words. I think every parent who's ever loved their child properly has wondered, at some point, if they're the wrong person for the job, he said. I certainly have, this past month, more times than I'd admit to anyone but you. But I watched you sit up with Odalis during that scare in the 3rd month, asking every single question you could think of so you'd know exactly how to keep her safe. I've watched you talk to her every night before you fall asleep, even though she can't understand a word of it yet. I don't think a person who wasn't built for this does either of those things. I think you're already exactly the parent she needs, Kirk. I don't think that's in question at all. I cried that night, the good kind of crying, and slept better afterward than I had in weeks. Rowan visited often during those final months, and my mother came to stay for the last few weeks, entirely filling the too large house with the warmth it had never had before, teaching Charles over his mild protests. 3 different soups he insisted on mastering before the baby came, as though feeding me properly were something he could control, when so much else about the coming weeks wasn't. Labor came 2 days past when Dr. Pharaoh had predicted, in the middle of a quiet afternoon that gave no warning at all before it suddenly became the most important day of both our lives. Charles's composure, so carefully maintained through boardrooms and pack councils and a rival's blackmail attempt, dissolved entirely somewhere around hour 6, and it was Odalis, calm as ever, who kept both of us steady through the long hours that followed. I remember very little of the worst of it clearly. The way pain tends to blur itself in memory even when it refuses to blur in the moment. What I remember with absolute clarity is the sound that came after, small, furious, entirely new to the world, and Charles's face wrecked open with an emotion too large for any word I've ever learned. As he looked down at our daughter for the first time. "Hello," he said to her, voice breaking on the single syllable. And I understood, watching him, that whatever fear he'd carried about becoming his own father had ended in that instant, replaced completely by something gentler and infinitely more certain. We named her Sable after no one in particular, simply because we both liked the sound of it, and because Charles said quietly that it suited a girl who'd already proven, kicking through the last month of my pregnancy with an insistence neither of us could talk her out of, that she intended to be exactly as stubborn as both her parents combined. The contract we'd signed that first day, the actual paper, with its clauses about dinners twice weekly and settlements at the end of 2 years, still exists somewhere in a filing cabinet in Charles's study. He pulled it out one evening a few weeks after Sable was born. Both of us sprawled across the enormous bed that no longer felt too large for anything her bassinet within arm's reach, her small fists working the air in her sleep the way they did whenever she dreamed of something urgent enough to fight for. "We should frame it," he said, thoughtful, turning the pages over, "as a reminder." "Of what?" "That you bought me? That I got extraordinarily lucky." He set the papers aside and reached instead for my hand, lacing our fingers together over the blanket between us. "I wrote a contract to protect myself from ever needing anything from anyone. I built every clause specifically so nothing could touch me. And somewhere in the middle of trying not to feel anything for you, I fell in love so completely I don't remember agreeing to it. I'd sign it again tomorrow, every single clause, just to end up exactly here." I laughed, and my eyes went unexpectedly wet because new parenthood had made me embarrassingly prone to both at once, and I pulled him down by the collar to kiss him, unhurried, certain. Nothing at all like that first handshake in front of an officiant who'd had no idea what he was actually witnessing. "For the record," I murmured against his mouth, glancing toward the bassinet where our daughter slept, oblivious to how entirely her existence had rewritten both our lives. "I never expected any of this. Not the marriage, not you. Certainly not her. I signed a contract to save my family. I never expected to fall in love with the man on the other side of the desk. I definitely never expected to carry his child, in a bed I once thought I'd hate sleeping in for 2 years and then walk away from without looking back." "And now?" Charles asked, voice soft, his eyes doing that bright, unguarded thing they only did for me, only ever for me, in rooms with no board members and no cameras, and no reason to perform anything at all. "Now," I said, "I can't imagine walking away from any of it, not you, not this house, not her." Sable stirred faintly in the bassinet, one small fist finding her own mouth, and settled again. "I think I was always supposed to end up here. I just needed a contract to get me through the door." He kissed my forehead, then my temple, then my mouth again, slow and thorough and entirely unhurried, a man with nowhere else in the world he needed to be. 2 years, minimum," he murmured, quoting himself, quoting that cold, careful voice from a glass office that felt like it belonged to strangers now. "That's what I told you." I remember thinking I was being generous. "You were an idiot," I said, laughing against his mouth. "I was," he agreed, "the most fortunate idiot alive. I asked for 2 years and a signature. I got a family instead. I got you." He glanced over at the bassinet, at the small, fierce sleeping proof of everything neither of us had planned for, and both of us now couldn't imagine living without. Whatever this is now, Kirk, it was never in the contract. We wrote every real part of it ourselves, one accident at a time. I wouldn't change a single clause. Outside the house that had once swallowed sound, had learned slowly over the better part of a year to hold laughter instead, mine his and now hers too. Filling rooms that had once felt too large for anyone to survive in alone. I thought of the velvet-lined pen, the cold desk, the version of myself who'd signed his name away to save the people he loved and never once imagined he'd end up saving himself in the process. I hadn't expected any of it. Not the marriage, not the falling, not the small, furious cry that had rewritten every quiet, careful line either of us had ever drawn around what our lives were supposed to be. But I would sign that contract again, every time, if it meant ending up exactly here. In his arms in our home, our daughter sleeping safe within reach of us both, and both of us entirely and helplessly, already loved. If you made it to the end, you're my kind of person. Leave a subscribe. Comment down your favorite part of the story, and if you want early access to videos, exclusive content, or just want to support the channel, make sure to join our Patreon. Link is in the description. Even one member genuinely means the world to me. See you in the next one.